Alright, so this video is coming out Christmas Day 2024, and obviously I'm not so heartless as to not hope that everyone has a good day, regardless of whether or not you're celebrating it. And I believe it is also the first night of Hanukkah anyway, so you could be celebrating it for a completely different reason. But this kind of nuance and complication only really exists in this world, or derivations thereof. Obviously, you don't need to celebrate Christmas to know that Christmas exists, but you do need to be in a world where it does exist. In a universe where Christianity didn't become a major world religion, and then one of its holidays get adopted as a massive secular deal too, I would just be telling everyone to have a good day, look forward to New Year's next week. So, that being said, I believe you can now understand why I'm specifically only wishing a Merry Christmas to the cast of Xenoblade Chronicles X and the Xenosaga trilogy, as nobody else in the series really even has the knowledge to know what I would be talking about. However, while those two games are the only ones that have a strong enough connection to Earth for the real holiday of Christmas to still exist in their worlds, and, well, Xenoblade X takes place 3 decades from now in the United States, you bet commercial Christmas is still a big thing then. There are also very heavily Christian-inspired fictional religions in the worlds of Xenogears in Xenoblade 2, so maybe those worlds do have at least a similar holiday. And one of those is the one I'm going to be talking about in this video, because how do holidays work in the world of Xenoblade 2 to begin with? I'm gonna need to spoil that game, but it's only that game, thankfully. Also, hey, I'm recording this on December 1st. Happy 7th anniversary Xenoblade 2. The wind is blowing very hard this December. The thing that makes Xenoblade 2 the more interesting of the two to talk about in this realm, though, is the fact that its world is built on the ashes of human civilization on Earth. It's just that the only person who actually knows this is Klaus, who's first met by someone from the surface of Alrest about 6 hours before the world gets fundamentally changed by the end of the game, and is the guy worshipped as a god by the Christian-based religion in this world in the first place. The first thing to bring up is that Alrest is Earth in the future, but only in the future on a geologic timescale, not an astronomical one. Yes, life has had to partially re-evolve, but the moon hasn't drifted too much further away, the tidal locking of the Earth-Moon system doesn't seem to have changed at all, and the sun is still the same way it is now. It hasn't gotten bigger or changed color or anything, which means astronomy is going to work just as well for learning how the world works as it did for the predecessors of our current human civilizations. And the Gregorian calendar is a 500-year-old modification to a 2,000-year-old calendar whose development was overseen by literally Julius Caesar, and considering Alrest recorded contiguous history is over twice that old, they probably would have figured something very similar to current timekeeping out. While yes, they are probably millions of years in the future, and currently the day is getting longer while the year is getting shorter, so the amount of days in a month and the length of the equivalents of minute and second are probably going to be significantly different. Ultimately, if you convert the units, it would still work out and be intelligible by someone with enough astronomical and mathematical knowledge from the current day. Remember, while characters like Adenine exist, throughout the entire game, the only STEM majors we really get to learn a lot about the work of are the engineers making artificial blades. So we never really get to hear about their other sciences, but I'd find it hard to believe that Alrest was able to jump to sentient androids on the tech development tree without figuring out all the important advances in physics that are easily discovered by researching orbital mechanics and the way the solar system works. It is known that the Titans migrate around the world tree semi-periodically, and I would guess that individual nations do mark time in some ways by these motions, but it is still an interconnected society, and they'd need some sort of universal way of timekeeping so everyone can understand what's being talked about. And since Indal, in its religious capacity, appears to be the closest thing to a governing body above the nation state that the world has, it would make sense that they were the one to implement such systems for just use in international communication. And hey, remember the Julius Caesar calendar I talked about before? He oversaw its development in his role as the chief religious official of Rome, so there is more real-world precedent to that, even though obviously Caesar's term as Pontifex Maximus predates the Catholicism that actually inspired Indal by quite a bit. So they clearly have the capacity to have holidays, at the very least. If they can have a calendar, they can have at least the kind of holiday that shows up on the same date every year. We don't really know what their equivalents of weeks and months would be, so we don't know how they would have an equivalent to holidays that are on, like, the same weekday every year in a certain month on a certain week or that kind of thing, but they can have some kind of holiday, which means we can think about kind of the different categories that holidays can fall under. And some of the generalized categories would be commemorating certain people, certain historical events, certain days of religious significance for whatever reason, and season-related things. And because of the way Alrest is different than Earth, the ways certain of these categories exist are going to be different compared to in the real world. Firstly, from all the dialogue we've seen, it does seem like birthday celebrations do exist across most cultures in Alrest, and I think we can assume that they use your birthday relative to the Indaline astronomical calendar as opposed to the Titan-based ones, because that would make, again, not just timekeeping, but also ages inconsistent across different countries. Then there's probably the most historically significant and religiously significant days in recent memory. The former would be the end of the Aegis War, which is a conflict that was world-spanning and affected every known nation at least to some degree, so that would be a universally celebrated holiday, presumably on the same date on the Indaline calendar every year. And for the religious side is something related, that being the day Amalthus is said to have reached Elysium. I'm not sure specifically what the celebrations for that would be, like, yeah, probably some sort of feast or whatever, but presumably there would be some sort of ritual and giving thanks to the architect and all that. And I could also see there being some sort of holiday commemorating humanity being kicked out of Elysium. While the Indaline religion is obviously based on Christianity, and specifically Catholicism, the two big differences I can see on a surface level are, first off, it's not a messianic religion. There is no equivalent to Jesus here. There is God being the architect, but even though Malos, or Logos specifically, is in the position of the Son in the Trinity of the Trinity processor, because the only Aegis history remembers is Malos, and he caused the devastating Aegis War, despite being the closest thing to a messiah, the Aegis is not viewed as one. Secondly, we don't really hear anything about their creation story, which is kind of interesting. There's no known story about how the world came to be, and the earliest thing we really know is the tale of humanity getting kicked out of Elysium. So, since we don't really know anything about what they say about how the world came into existence, the closest thing related to that they might celebrate or at least commemorate would be the date humanity is said to have left Elysium on. Even if Amalthus isn't actually acknowledged as the guy who made it to Elysium in the present day, there is a good chance that simply because he's been the praetor for almost 5 centuries, Amalthus's birthday is regarded as some sort of significant day, or at the very least, he's been granted something similar to saint status while still being alive, so if Indal has something equivalent to the calendar of saints, Amalthus's feast day is also probably a relatively big deal too. I'm also betting that the day Mithra was awakened was celebrated by Adam's faithful in at least some capacity for a few years following the end of the Aegis War, but once Amalthus consolidated power, that was almost certainly completely stamped out, especially because Mithra's existence is barely acknowledged by history whatsoever, and even Leftheria doesn't have anything connected to it. As for celebrating individual people in a more secular capacity, I could easily see each nation having some sort of celebration for the reigning monarch's birthday, as well as lesser ones for other prominent members of the royal family, and a big deal being made out of coronations and state funerals would also likely be a thing. I could see the founding day of some nations being something to be celebrated as well, probably more likely the younger ones just because the specific date would be a known thing in more recent times, and that likely would be something on each nation's calendar revolving around the Titan. So, that would mean nations that celebrate their founding or important historical dates for that nation would do it relative to that nation's calendar, so it would likely fall on a slightly different date each time in the main Indaline calendar, which is very interesting and a neat bit of interplay that you don't really see that much in the real world anymore, because the vast majority of it does use the Gregorian. At the very least, I refuse to believe that the Argentum Trade Guild doesn't have a week-long sale every year commemorating its founding. Of course, given how Argentum was built and not necessarily founded on an existing Titan, it probably just uses the Indoline calendar as default, which also makes sense because it's an international trade hub. The one category I mentioned that I didn't really bring up at all yet is seasonal related ones, or things related to the passing of time or the passage during a given year. And that's because I don't know how many of those would exist in a similar state to reality in Alrest, purely because of how seasons work there. While yes, they are on Earth, and Earth has seasons, so Alrest would have seasons, the thing is that the beanstalk is located on the equator, and as far as we know, all of the Titans on Alrest live in a relatively close proximity relative to the size of the world to the beanstalk. We don't know how the Klaus event and the Cloud Sea affect global weather patterns, but no matter what they are, because everything's near the equator, seasons will be much less pronounced in Alrest when compared to many places in the modern day, and especially the late medieval, early Renaissance Europe that it seems like Alrest's international politics are mostly inspired by. Then there's the fact that the overwhelming majority of the planet's surface is covered in Cloud Sea nanomachines, which are going to mean it's the same consistency around the entire world. There will be no additional atmospheric effects from there being regions with higher elevation or lower elevation, or different places having different local temperatures based on things other than the Earth's tilt because of what material the ground is made up of. This should mean that weather around the entire world is going to be a lot more uniform and a lot less extreme, and this is actually somewhat backed up by the game because we don't really see any of them during it, tropical cyclones probably aren't going to be an issue despite Alrest taking place on the equator, because you need an ocean for one of those to form, and there aren't big pieces of standing water left in the world. I mean, the oceans do still exist, but they're all under the Cloud Sea, and based on how dense it is to allow you to swim in it and how pressurized it gets at lower levels, I don't know how much of the stuff from underneath that is able to interact with the atmosphere at all, outside of literally just the Great Void, where there is straight up a hole in the sea. If anything, the weather around the cliffs of Moritha should be really extreme, and arguably contain types of weather not found anywhere else in Alrest, and probably some forms that don't exist in the real world at all, because last time I checked, we haven't yet screwed up the environment to make something like the Great Void. Extreme heavy emphasis on yet, unfortunately. Although, on that train of thought, I don't know if this was intentional by the writers or intentional by Klaus, but it seems like in addition to just restoring the destroyed surface of the planet, the Cloud Sea is also somewhat correcting climate change. And that's simply because of its color. The Cloud Sea was named the Cloud Sea by the citizens of Alrest, not even by Klaus, because it looks like regular atmospheric clouds. Ergo, it's a color very close to white, and once again, covers 99.995% of the surface of the Earth, or something ridiculous like that. Which means the planet's albedo, or the amount of light it receives from the sun that gets reflected back out into space, is going to be significantly higher than it is in present day, which means the atmosphere and the ground are going to be absorbing less heat from the sun, and as such, global temperatures on average will be noticeably lower than present day Earth. In fact, artificially increasing Earth's albedo by things like giant mirrors in space or putting big white sheets over areas like parts of the oceans or the Sahara are proposed ways for combating climate change. Oh, don't you see, Rubido? I'm not just such a big deal that they made a real scientific concept named after me. They put me in another Xeno game without even trying. I have more appearances than you now, Rubido. How does this make you feel? I need an adult. Rubido, I am an adult.
Well, I'm switching us back to the Xenoblade 2 footage before this video gets copyright claimed.
So we've got subtle, more uniform weather around the entire planet, which means on a macro scale, seasons are not really going to change for all of Alrest at once. And then there's the fact that local weather is also dependent on the Titans, and the Titans might not have periodic, evenly spaced out cycles like seasons in the real world do, because they're living beings that might spontaneously undergo certain issues or have certain changes happen. Let's just use Gormott as an example. Very pastoral society. Basically everyone who lives outside Toragath is some sort of farmer. Do they have harvest festivals, or some sort of day where everyone in a certain village begins harvesting their crops. How would they know when to have that every year? Well, on a macro scale, the weather's not likely to change over the course of an Indaline astronomical year all that much, so it's unlikely they'll be able to look at global weather patterns to find a good time for crops to have been properly grown or for it to be good enough weather to start actually harvesting them. And okay, maybe there's another day dependent on the cycles of the Titan, like say it gets to a certain place away from the world tree where it's on a high enough latitude for things to cool off a bit, so they could safely just go out and wouldn't be sweating all day by picking stuff. Okay, well, what about the Titan? Is the Titan running a fever? Because then it will be even hotter than a day in quote-unquote summer when it's closer to the equator. Despite some factors being non-existent, other factors could be so complicated or arcane that it would be impossible for a human farmer to predict them, so crop scheduling and rotating and planting certain things at certain times of the year might not be able to exist in Alrest the same way they did even hundreds of years ago in the real world, which could have some really interesting connotations on just the development of civilization in Alrest as a whole that I'm not about to get into this time, but the more you think about it, the more it gets really interesting and would probably back up the way that Alrest is. Like, even with Amalthus intentionally letting Titans die, there's no way it got so depopulated over just 500 years that you could fit everyone from Alrest just in the habitat of Elysium. There had to have been other things keeping the population relatively small long before Amalthus ever took power, and there being a strict low upper limit on how efficient farming can be per capita could genuinely be a reason why. And yeah, all of this came from just me thinking about whether or not there's a similar holiday to Christmas in Alrest where they dress up the world tree in lights or something like that. Wait a minute, that actually kind of makes sense. A day celebrating the world tree where you cut down a tree from outside and bring it into your house to make your house a microcosm of the entire world, which is sort of like a house being watched over by the big world tree. And because some of the holographic lights up there are visible from the surface, then they'd put lights on them to mimic that. There we go. We invented Alrestian Christmas. See you guys next time. Have a happy holidays. Why did I make this video?